We're working new details in a high-profile case in Rhode Island where a suspect in custody shot and killed a police detective with his own gun. You remember Estvon Karpio was convicted of first-degree murder for killing Detective James Allen.
Estvon Karpio was slumped in the back of a cruiser, looking like a total skell while the Providence rain streaked the windows. The local PD had picked him up on a lead for the brutal stabbing of an 84-year-old lady, and they were ready to put him through the ringer. As they marched him through the station, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Karpio wasn't just some small-time perp. He was a walking powder keg, his eyes darting around like a trapped rat looking for a hole to crawl into. The officers led him up to the third-floor interrogation wing, past rows of desks where weary detectives were buried in paperwork. They figured they had him dead to rights, just a routine booking for a violent offense. They threw him into a cramped interview room, the kind of bleak concrete box that's seen 1,000 lies, and left him there to stew. No one bothered to cuff him to the table because, on paper, he was just a suspect, not a convicted killer yet. He sat there, twitching, his mind a chaotic mess of static and paranoia, while the boys in blue prepared their questions. Little did they know, this routine stop was about to turn into a total shambles that would haunt the department for decades. The silence in the room was heavy, but the storm inside Karpio's head was just getting started. Detective Sergeant James Allen walked into the room with the calm confidence of a veteran who'd seen every trick in the book. He was a good egg, a family man, and a pillar of the force who didn't expect a simple interview to turn into a fight for his life. Allen sat across from Karpio, his notebook open, ready to get the tea on the stabbing from the day before. Everything seemed steady until the second detective stepped out for a split second to grab a file. In that heartbeat, the devil took the wheel, and Karpio went from 0 to 100. He lunged across the table like a wild dog, his hands clawing for anything he could grab. A desperate, brutal scramble broke out in that tiny space as Karpio fought to snatch Allen's piece from his holster. It was a nightmare scenario. Close quarters, raw adrenaline, and a veteran fighting for his soul. Before anyone could intervene, 2 shots rang out, muffled by the heavy walls, but loud enough to shatter the peace of the precinct forever. Karpio had done the unthinkable. He clapped a decorated officer right inside the heart of his own house. Detective Allen slumped over, and the room went deathly quiet. Karpio stood there for a second, the smoking gun in his hand, realizing he had just punched a one-way ticket to the big house if he didn't move fast. Estvon Karpio didn't hang around for the cavalry to burst through the door and end him. He knew the whole building was about to be crawling with every Fed and beat cop in Rhode Island, and he wasn't about to be taken like a sitting duck. He bolted out of the interview room, his heart hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. The hallway was a blur of beige paint and panic as alarms began to blare. He didn't head for the stairs. He knew the exits would be locked down tighter than a drum. Instead, he spotted a third-story window and didn't think twice. With a roar of pure desperation, he smashed through the glass, shards flying like diamonds in the fluorescent light, and took a literal leap of faith into the dark night. He hit the pavement with a bone-shaking thud that should have snapped him in half, but the adrenaline was a hell of a drug. He scrambled to his feet, bloodied and looking like a total mess, and started hauling tail through the Providence streets. He was a ghost in the shadows for a few hours, ducking into alleys and trying to outrun the sirens that were closing in from every direction. The hunt was on, and the heat was blistering. Eventually, the cops swarmed him blocks away, taking him down hard. By the time they hauled him back, he looked like he'd gone 12 rounds with a freight train.
He was mentally ill, and he needed help, and we couldn't get it. We tried and tried.
Estvon Karpio made his first appearance in the courtroom, and it was a sight that turned the city's stomach. He was wheeled in rocking a white plastic mask that looked like something out of a low-budget horror flick, meant to hide the mangled, swollen mess of his face from the jump in the arrest. His crew was in the gallery crying, claiming he was loco and that his brain had totally snapped during the interrogation. They were pushing for the insanity plea, hoping to dodge the needle or a permanent stay in a cage. But the prosecution wasn't buying the crazy act for a second. They argued he knew exactly what he was doing when he grabbed that gun. The trial was a media circus, but the jury saw right through the mask and the excuses. They didn't care about the mental break talk when a hero like Detective Allen was lying in the ground. After the lawyers finished their smack talk, the jury came back with the hammer. Guilty on all counts. The judge didn't pull any punches either, handing him life without parole. No deals, no early outs, no good behavior passes. Karpio was sent to the state max to rot for the rest of his natural life. It was a wrap for the man who turned a police station into a kill zone, leaving the department to sweep up the glass and remember the heavy price of a routine interview.
Pieces of the story the public couldn't see for 6 years. The video starts with a traffic stop roughly 19 hours before the deadly shooting, then body-worn camera video of officers conducting.
Hollis Daniels III was a 19-year-old freshman at Texas Tech when the campus atmosphere turned from a routine Monday into a nightmare on October 9, 2017. It started with a call about a student acting erratically, which prompted Officer Floyd East, Jr. to head over to the dorms for a welfare check. Once inside, the cops didn't just find a kid who was tripping out. They spotted drugs and drug paraphernalia sitting right out in the open. The situation escalated fast, and before he knew it, Daniels was being hauled off to the campus police station for booking. He wasn't some hardened perp with a long sheet, but the vibe was heavy because his family had already called the university, warning that he might be suicidal and armed with a piece. Despite the erratic behavior reports, the search at the dorm was somehow botched, and Daniels managed to keep a loaded .45 caliber handgun tucked away. He was brought into the station and sat down for the paperwork, but in a massive lapse of security, the officers didn't cuff him to the bench. He sat there looking like just another student caught with some grass, but inside, he was a ticking time bomb waiting for the right second to go off. Officer Floyd East, Jr. was a 48-year-old family man who had only been on the force for 5 months, just trying to do his job and get through the shift. He was sitting at a desk in the briefing room, his head down as he focused on the booking forms and digital entries needed to process the arrest. Daniels was seated nearby, unrestrained and watching every move like a hawk. When another officer stepped out of the room, leaving East alone with the suspect, the silence became lethal. Without a word or a warning, Daniels stood up, produced the concealed .45, and clapped Officer East in the back of the head at point-blank range. The sound of the shot ripped through the quiet station, a single bang that signaled a total security shambles. Daniels didn't just pull the trigger and bolt. He reached over and snatched Officer East's body camera, likely trying to bury the evidence of his cold-blooded move. By the time the other officers rushed back in, they found their brother in blue mortally wounded on the floor and the suspect gone into the night. It was a brutal, illogical act that turned a simple drug bust into a capital murder case in a matter of seconds. Hollis Daniels III vanished into the darkness of the Texas Tech campus, triggering an immediate and frantic lockdown. Sirens wailed across Lubbock as the shelter-in-place alerts hit every student's phone, turning the university into a ghost town. The cavalry was out in full force. Local PD, campus cops, and state troopers flooded the streets, looking for a shooter they knew was armed and dangerous. Daniels was a ghost for nearly 2 hours, lurking in the shadows near the Municipal Coliseum while the whole city was on edge. The heat was blistering, and there was nowhere left to run. Eventually, officers spotted him, and a foot chase broke out. They tackled him to the dirt before he could cause any more carnage. When they searched him, they found the loaded handgun and the stolen body camera, proving he was the one who had just messed up and shot their friend. As they hauled him back to the station in real cuffs this time, the reality of what he'd done started to settle in. He told the investigators he'd done something illogical, a weak excuse for a move that had just ended a veteran's life and destroyed a family. Hollis Daniels III sat in the Lubbock County Courthouse years later, no longer the erratic freshman, but a man facing the ultimate price for his crimes. The trial was a heavy, emotional circus where the prosecution laid out the cold facts of the ambush, showing how he had exploited a moment of trust to kill a peace officer. The state was originally gunning for the death penalty, wanting to send him to the needle for the capital hit on Officer East. His defense team fought hard, leaning on his mental state and personal history to keep him off death row. In early 2023, Daniels decided to skip the gamble and pleaded guilty to capital murder, leaving his fate in the hands of a jury for the punishment phase. After hearing the heartbreaking testimony from East's widow and daughters, the jury deliberated on whether he was a continuing threat to society. They eventually spared his life, but made sure he'd never taste freedom again, handing down a sentence of life without parole. He was shipped off to the Big House in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, where he'll rot until his last breath. The case was finally a wrap, leaving the campus to remember the officer who lost his life during a routine welfare check.
Monday, May 16.
Shots fired outside the sheriff's office. EMS dead. Suspect down. We need help.
Gary Rowland was a career criminal who had spent enough time in the system to know exactly how to play the compliant suspect role. On May 16, 2022, in western Kentucky, the Boys in Blue picked him up on a string of warrants involving drugs, firearms, and parole violations. They had him in custody outside the Marshall County Sheriff's Office, where he was being grilled by a specialized drug task force. Rowland acted like he was cooperating, keeping his cool and speaking calmly to the detectives. He played the part so well that the officer's guard started to slip, a fatal mistake in the world of high-stakes policing. Rowland eventually asked for a cigarette, a common trust move used to get a breather and de-escalate the vibe. Because he'd been acting like a good boy, the officers agreed to the request, escorting him to a bench just outside the building. What they didn't know was that their search had been a total shambles. Despite being under arrest, Rowland was still packing a concealed handgun that he'd managed to tuck away. He sat there, taking a drag and waiting for the perfect split second when the eyes on him shifted, ready to turn a routine break into a bloodbath. Chief Deputy Jodie Cash was a veteran with over 20 years on the force, a man who had dedicated his life to cleaning up the streets of Kentucky. He was standing right there with Rowland, likely thinking the interview was heading in the right direction. As the smoke curled into the air, the atmosphere felt controlled, almost casual. But in a heartbeat, the calm suspect turned into a lethal threat. Rowland reached into his clothes, produced the hidden piece, and opened fire at point-blank range. There was no smack talk, no warning, just the sudden pop-pop of a handgun shattering the afternoon peace. Chief Deputy Cash was hit before he could even process that he was under fire. It was a cold-blooded ambush in a secure area where the officers felt safe. The proximity was so close that there was no room for error. Rowland had exploited a moment of human decency, the simple act of allowing a man a cigarette, to commit a calculated hit on a high-ranking officer. In that one moment, the veteran detective's long career was cut short by a perp who had nothing left to lose. Gary Rowland didn't get to celebrate his win for more than a couple of seconds. As soon as the first shots rang out, the other deputies on the scene went into full combat mode. They didn't freeze or hesitate. They drew their service weapons and unleashed the heat to stop the threat. A chaotic shootout erupted right there in the parking lot of the sheriff's office. Lead was flying as the deputies scrambled for cover while simultaneously returning fire to protect their fallen brother. Rowland, caught in the open with nowhere to run, was riddled with bullets as the officers neutralized him. The sounds of sirens began to wail almost instantly as the entire department rushed to the scene. It was a total war zone for a few minutes, with the smell of gunpowder and cigarette smoke mixing in the air. Both Rowland and Chief Deputy Cash were down, bleeding out on the pavement. The cavalry arrived in record time, but the damage was already done. Paramedics rushed both men to the hospital, but the grim reality was settling in. This wasn't a movie, and not everyone was going to make it off that bench alive. Gary Rowland never made it back to a jail cell or a courtroom to face a jury for what he'd done. He was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after the gunfight, ending his long history of crime with a final violent act. But the real tragedy was the loss of Chief Deputy Jodie Cash, who also succumbed to his wounds. The news hit the community like a ton of bricks. He was a legend in the area, a straight shooter who had served with the state police before joining the sheriff's office. The investigation that followed focused on the massive security failure, how a guy with firearm warrants was allowed to keep a gun through an arrest and a search. It was a hard lesson learned in blood, forcing departments across the state to tighten up their search protocols and rethink the compliancy of suspects. There were no masks or long trials this time, just a funeral with a sea of blue uniforms and a department left to wonder how a simple smoke break turned into a funeral. Roland died a skell, leaving behind a legacy of chaos, while the city mourned a hero who lost his life because he gave a suspect a bit too much slack.
A grand jury has indicted the Jefferson County Courthouse shooting suspect on a new charge. The grand jury indicted 41-year-old Bartholomew Granger for...
Bartholomew Granger was a man backed into a corner and ready to burn the whole world down with him. It was March 14, 2012, and he was at the Jefferson County Courthouse in Beaumont, Texas, for a trial that was going to expose his darkest secrets. He was being charged with the sexual assault of his own daughter. He knew he was looking at a permanent stay in the big house, and he wasn't about to let the system do him without a fight. Instead of walking in like a man ready to face the music, he pulled up to the curb with a trunk full of lead and a heart full of hate. He was a skell on a mission, a ticking time bomb dressed in civilian clothes. As he approached the building, he wasn't looking for his lawyer, he was looking for targets. He had a semi-auto rifle tucked away, and he was ready to turn a legal proceeding into a total shambles. The peace of the morning was about to be shattered by a man who decided that if he was going down, he was taking everyone, including his own family, to the grave with him. Bartholomew Granger didn't even make it inside before he unleashed the heat. As his daughter and her mother walked toward the courthouse doors, hoping for justice, Granger pulled his rifle and started spraying the sidewalk. It was a cold-blooded ambush in broad daylight. The pop-pop of the rifle echoed off the marble walls as people scrambled for cover, diving behind parked cars and stone pillars. In the chaos, he struck his own daughter and her mother, showing the world that he was a perp with zero soul left. A 79-year-old bystander, Minnie Ray Liggins, was caught in the crossfire and tragically clapped right there on the concrete. The courthouse was instantly plunged into a lockdown as active shooter screams ripped through the hallways. Lawmen inside the building, including deputies and local PD, rushed toward the sound of the gunfire, realizing that a madman was turning the Temple of Justice into a slaughterhouse. Granger didn't stop firing until the magazines were empty, creating a kill zone in a place that was supposed to be the safest block in the city. Bartholomew Granger didn't plan on sticking around for the cavalry to pin him down. He hopped into his pickup truck and peeled out, turning the streets of Beaumont into a high-stakes demolition derby. He was a ghost behind the wheel, ramming into cars and dodging the blue and whites that were swarming from every direction. The heat was blistering as officers laid out spike strips and tried to box him in. During the chase, Granger continued to trade lead with the pursuing cruisers, showing he was playing for keeps. Eventually, he tried to hide out at a nearby construction business, hoping to slip away in the confusion. But the boys in blue had him boxed in. A massive shootout erupted as SWAT and local officers surrounded the building, unleashing a wall of fire to neutralize the threat. Granger was hit during the exchange, finally ending his rampage in a cloud of dust and gunpowder. They dragged him out of the building in cuffs, his tough guy spree ending with him bleeding out on the pavement while the sirens wailed in the background. Bartholomew Granger sat in a different courtroom a year later, but this time he wasn't the one in control. The trial was a grim recap of the Beaumont massacre, with the prosecution showing the jury the heartbreaking footage of the sidewalk shooting. They had him dead to rights. The rifle, the truck, and dozens of witnesses who saw the monster behind the glass. During the trial, his own daughter testified against him, a powerful moment that sealed his fate in the eyes of everyone in the room. The jury didn't buy any temporary insanity smack talk. They saw a calculated killer who had hunted his own flesh and blood. In 2013, the judge dropped the hammer and handed down the death penalty. No life without parole deals for a man who turned a courthouse into a war zone. He was shipped off to the big house on death row, where he'd wait for the needle to finally close the book on his crimes. The case was a wrap, a permanent reminder that even in the halls of justice, evil can show up with a rifle, but the system always collects its debt in the end.
It was a routine traffic stop that turned into the most deadly police shooting in Oakland's history. 3 officers were killed and a 4th has been declared brain dead.
This is an extraordinary tragedy.
Lavelle Mixon was a 26-year-old parolee who had skipped out on his supervision, and on March 21, 2009, he was driving through Oakland with a mind full of bad intentions and a heavy piece tucked away. When 2 motorcycle officers, Sergeant Mark Dunnican and Sergeant John Heggie, pulled him over for a routine traffic stop, they figured it was just another stop and talk. But Mixon knew he was looking at a trip back to the big house if they ran his name, and he wasn't about to go quietly. As the officers approached his ride, Mixon didn't reach for his license. He reached for a handgun and opened fire, clapping both sergeants before they could even draw their weapons. It was a cold, calculated ambush that left 2 veteran lawmen bleeding out on the asphalt in broad daylight. Mixon didn't hang around to see the damage. He bolted from the scene, disappearing into the maze of the Oakland streets while the sirens started to wail. He was a ghost on the run, a desperate skell who had just declared war on the entire Oakland PD, and the heat that was about to descend on him was going to be biblical.
Old. He was on parole, and he had a warrant out for his arrest for violating that parole.
Lavelle Mixon scrambled into a nearby apartment building on 74th Avenue, barricading himself in a bathroom while the cavalry swarmed the block. Within minutes, the area was crawling with every beat cop, Fed, and SWAT operator in Northern California. The air was thick with tension as the department realized they had 2 officers down and an armed lunatic loose in a residential zone. The SWAT team didn't hesitate. They got the T on his location and moved in with heavy armor and flashbangs, ready to end the nightmare. They breached the apartment, but Mixon was dug in like a tick, armed with an SKS assault rifle that he'd been hiding for just such a moment. As the officers pushed through the door, Mixon unleashed a wall of lead, shredding the drywall and hitting the lead officers in the stack. He wasn't just defending himself, he was hunting, looking to take as many of the boys in blue with him as he could. The hallway became a kill zone in a split second, proving that Mixon was a level 10 threat who had totally lost his grip on reality.
Lavelle Mixon didn't stop firing until the bathroom was a sieve of bullet holes and plaster dust. In that brutal exchange, he managed to strike 3 more officers. Sergeant Daniel Sakai and Sergeant Irvin Romans were killed, while a 3rd officer was wounded but survived. It was the deadliest day in the history of the Oakland Police Department, a total massacre that left the force reeling. The cops outside couldn't believe the radio chatter. They had lost 4 brothers in a single afternoon to 1 lone gunman. Mixon was playing for keeps, trading shots with the best of the best until his luck finally ran out. During the final breach, the SWAT team returned the heat with everything they had, finally putting enough lead into the bathroom to neutralize the threat for good. When the smoke cleared, the Facebook fugitive of Oakland was dead on the tile, his rampage ended by a hail of justice. It was a lead-filled finale for a man who had turned a sunny afternoon into a graveyard, leaving the city in a state of absolute shock and mourning.
Lavelle Mixon left behind a city scarred and a department broken by grief. There was no courtroom drama or death penalty appeals for this skell. He got his verdict in that bathroom. The funeral for the 4 fallen officers was a sea of blue, with thousands of lawmen from across the country coming to pay their respects to the good eggs who were taken out by a cowardly ambush. The investigation that followed dug into how a parolee with a violent history and a stash of illegal rifles was able to slip through the cracks of the system for so long. It forced a massive overhaul of how California handled high-risk parolees and changed the way SWAT teams approached barricaded suspects. Mixon's name became synonymous with the Oakland Massacre, a reminder of how quickly a routine traffic stop can turn into a mass casualty event when a perp decides he's never going back to a cage. The case was a wrap, but the empty seats at the precinct and the tears of the families served as a permanent reminder that in the streets of Oakland, the price of service can sometimes be everything.
On or about the 20th day of November, 2016, Otis Tyrone McCain.
First at 10, a violent outburst after a guilty verdict in the murder of a San Antonio detective. Moments after the jury announced.
Otis Tyrone McCain was a man fueled by a twisted sense of payback on a system he felt had done him dirty. On a bright Sunday morning in November 2016, he wasn't looking for a fair fight. He was looking for a target. He pulled his black sedan up behind a marked San Antonio police cruiser that was parked right outside the public safety headquarters. Inside the cruiser was Detective Benjamin Maronei, a 20-year veteran who was just minding his own business, hunched over his computer to write up a traffic ticket. McCain didn't hesitate. He hopped out of his ride, crept up to the driver's side window of the patrol car, and produced a 9mm piece. Before Maronei could even look up from his screen, McCain fired 2 shots through the window, striking the detective in the head. It was a total coward's move, a cold-blooded hit on a good egg who was just trying to finish his shift. McCain didn't say a word. He just hopped back in his car and peeled out, leaving a hole in the heart of the San Antonio PD. He thought he was a ghost, disappearing into the city traffic while the cops scrambled to figure out why one of their own had been clapped in broad daylight. Otis Tyrone McCain tried to play it cool after the hit, even going as far as to get married at the courthouse the very next day, thinking he could blend back into normal life. But the cavalry was already breathing down his neck. The San Antonio PD didn't sleep. They pulled every frame of surveillance footage from the headquarters and the surrounding streets, tracking his black sedan like bloodhounds. The heat was blistering, and the whole city was on edge as the images of his car hit the local news. Every beat cop and fed in the state was looking for the coward who'd ambushed a detective in a school zone. They caught a break when they spotted his vehicle at an apartment complex. SWAT teams moved in with surgical precision, surrounding him before he could pull any more stunts. When they finally pinned him down and threw the cuffs on him, McCain tried to justify his actions, shouting to reporters that he was upset about a custody battle and just lashed out at the first cop he saw. It was a pathetic excuse for a calculated execution, and the boys in blue made sure he went straight to a high-security cell to wait for his day in the hot seat. Otis Tyrone McCain sat in the courtroom years later, and the vibe was thick with tension. The prosecution didn't pull any punches, showing the jury the gruesome details of the ambush and the cold way McCain had hunted his victim. They had him dead to rights, with the video evidence and the forensic trail he'd left behind. During the trial, McCain's temper flared up again, proving he was still a loose cannon. In a shocking moment that left the gallery gasping, he actually lunged at a bailiff inside the courtroom, showing the same violent streak that had led to the murder. His defense team tried to paint him as a man pushed to the brink by emotional distress, but the jury wasn't buying the snap defense for a second. They saw a man who had intentionally targeted a police officer to make a point. The testimony from Maronei's family was heartbreaking, painting a picture of a dedicated public servant who was taken out by a skell with a grudge. After weeks of back-and-forth smack talk between the lawyers, the jury reached a verdict that everyone in the building was waiting for: guilty of capital murder. Otis Tyrone McCain stood before the judge in 2021 to hear his final fate. In Texas, when you kill a cop in cold blood, the state usually looks for the ultimate receipt. The jury didn't take long to decide that McCain was a continuing threat to society who deserved the harshest sentence on the books. They handed down the death penalty, punching his ticket to death row at the Polinsky unit. No life without parole deals, no good behavior passes, just a date with the needle. McCain sat there stone-faced as the judge dropped the hammer, likely realizing that his payback had cost him everything. He was hauled off to the big house to wait out his appeals in a tiny cage, a far cry from the streets where he thought he was a tough guy. Detective Maronei's seat at the precinct remained empty, a silent reminder of the day a routine traffic stop turned into a tragedy. The case was finally a wrap, proving once again that you might outrun the sirens for a day, but the system always collects its debt in the end.
An Oklahoma man accused in a string of violent crimes has been shot and killed. This is brand new video just into our newsroom. The U.S. Marshal Service says 38-year-old Michael Dale Vance Jr. was shot and killed late last night by a highway patrolman in Dewey County. Vance was accused in a string of carjackings, the shooting and wounding of 2 police officers, and the
Michael Dale Vance Jr. was already a wanted man with a rap sheet a mile long when he decided to go out in a blaze of glory on October 23, 2016. It started in Wellston, Oklahoma, when 2 deputies responded to a call, not knowing they were walking into a buzzsaw. Vance didn't wait for a greeting. He jumped out with an AK-47 and sprayed the patrol car, wounding both officers before they could even unholster their pieces. But that was just the warm-up for this skell. He hijacked their cruiser, drove to a nearby trailer park, and switched cars, but not before visiting his own kin. In a move that sickened the whole state, he hacked his uncle and aunt to death with a medical tool, trying to sever their heads because he was that far gone. He was a walking nightmare, a perp with nothing but ice in his veins, and he knew the whole state was about to become a hornet's nest. Instead of hiding, he went live on Facebook, covered in blood, telling his fans that it was the real deal and he wasn't planning on being taken alive.
And I would come, and you're just, you're so lucky this went down this way.
Michael Dale Vance Jr. turned his getaway into a twisted reality show, posting videos while he was hightailing it across the state. "This is real," he told the camera, rocking a blood-stained shirt and a manic grin while he checked his perimeter. He was a ghost on the highways, dodging the cavalry by switching rides like he was playing a video game. He even shot a woman at a gas station just to snatch her car, showing the world he didn't give a damn about collateral damage. The heat was blistering. Every trooper from Oklahoma City to the border was looking for the man with the rifle and the social media habit. The feds and local boys had the roads blocked, but Vance was slick, hiding out in a haystack in a remote field for days like a rat in a hole. He was playing a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek, and the whole country was watching the feed, waiting for the moment the live stream finally cut to black. Michael Dale Vance Jr. finally ran out of road on a dark stretch in Dewey County a week later. A local sheriff spotted his stolen truck, and the chase was on, a high-speed pursuit that looked like a scene out of a Hollywood flick. Vance wasn't going to pull over and put his hands up. He leaned out the window and started trading lead with the pursuing cruisers at 80 miles an hour. The cops weren't playing around anymore. They returned the heat with everything they had. The shootout was a wall of fire, with bullets shredding the truck and lighting up the night. Vance finally caught a round that forced him to a stop, but he hopped out of the cab still clutching that AK-47, ready to go down swinging. He wanted a suicide by cop finale, and the brave officers on the scene obliged, unleashing a hail of gunfire that stitched him up before he could take anyone else with him. It was a lead-filled ending for a man who had turned the state into his own personal slaughterhouse. Michael Dale Vance Jr. died right there on the asphalt, his body riddled with the consequences of a week-long rampage. There was no courtroom drama, no white masks, and no long-winded trials for this monster. When the smoke cleared, the investigators found a list of other targets he had planned to hit, proving that if the cavalry hadn't dropped the hammer, the body count would have kept climbing. The Facebook videos were taken down, leaving only a digital scar on the internet and a lot of questions about how a guy on the run could stay live while the world was hunting him. The families of his victims and the wounded deputies were left to pick up the pieces, knowing that the skell who caused it all was finally in the dirt. It was a wrap for the Facebook fugitive, a case that showed just how crazy the world gets when a violent criminal decides to broadcast his own destruction. Oklahoma finally breathed a sigh of relief, closing the book on one of the most chaotic manhunts in the history of the plains.
A second wave of murders shocks the state, giving parole a bad name.
Kenneth McDuff wasn't just a regular skell, he was a walking nightmare that haunted the Texas plains. Back in 1966, he earned his grisly nickname, the Broomstick Killer, after a night of pure, unadulterated evil. He and a buddy snatched 3 teenagers, and what followed was a total horror show that left the state of Texas shivering. McDuff didn't just kill, he was a sadistic perp who enjoyed the hunt. He was caught and handed the death penalty, and for a minute it looked like the system had finally taken out the trash. But then the Supreme Court hit the brakes on capital punishment in '72, and McDuff's sentence was commuted to life. Because the Texas prisons were bursting at the seams, this monster caught a get-out-of-jail-free card and was paroled in 1989. It was a total shambles of justice. The cops knew he was a wolf in sheep's clothing, but the bureaucrats let him walk right back onto the streets, where he immediately started looking for his next fix of chaos.
Kenneth McDuff didn't waste a single second of his freedom. As soon as he hit the pavement, the bodies started dropping again. He was a ghost on the highways, snatching women in broad daylight and leaving a trail of terror from Waco to Austin. He was a master at staying under the radar, using his knowledge of the system to dodge the cavalry. One of his most high-profile hits was a young mother named Melissa Northrup, snatched from a convenience store. The heat was blistering as the feds and the Texas Rangers realized they had a serial-killing machine back on the loose. McDuff was playing a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, treating the whole state like his personal hunting ground. Every time the boys in blue got a lead, he'd vanish into the brush, leaving behind nothing but grief and empty shell casings. He thought he was untouchable because he'd already beaten the needle once. But the blue wall was closing in, and this time they weren't going to let him slip through the cracks.
Kenneth McDuff finally ran out of luck in 1992 after a massive multi-state dragnet pinned him down. The cavalry tracked him all the way to Kansas, where he was working a regular job under a fake name, trying to blend in like a good egg. When the feds finally swarmed him and threw the cuffs on him, he didn't have any of that tough guy energy left. They hauled him back to Texas in a high-security transport, and the tea coming out of the investigation was sickening. He'd linked himself to at least 9 more murders since his parole, proving that letting him out was the biggest mistake in the history of the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. The public was out for blood, and the prosecution was ready to bring the heat. They had him dead to rights with forensic evidence and witness testimony that painted him as a remorseless predator. This time, there would be no commutes, no good behavior passes, and no second chances. Kenneth McDuff sat in the courtroom for the last time, facing a jury that looked at him like the monster he was. The trial was a grim parade of his crimes, and the smack talk from his lawyers about a rough upbringing didn't mean a thing to a city that had buried too many daughters. In 1998, the judge dropped the hammer and sent him back to death row. This time, the needle was waiting for him for real. On November 17, 1998, the Broomstick Killer finally took his last breath on a gurney in Huntsville. His death prompted a massive overhaul of the Texas parole system, now known as McDuff's Law, making it almost impossible for violent perps to get out early. It was a wrap for the most hated man in Texas history. He died a skell, leaving behind a legacy of pain. But his execution brought a long-overdue sense of peace to the families who had waited decades for justice to finally collect its debt.